talk don't buy.
And welcome to Let Them Talk. I'm Paul DiRienzo. We have a very interesting show for you tonight. Our guest in the studio live, Peter Janney, author of the book Mary's Mosaic. And he will and I will explain to you why in the background we have these folks and who they are. I mean, obviously you can see President Kennedy, John F. Kennedy to the right, and to his left, our right, on the right side of the screen, is Mary Pinchot Meyer, who is the subject, one of the subjects of this book. And we're going to be talking about Mary's Mosaic by Peter Janney, an interesting book about the JFK assassination, a different view than you might have recognized, than you might have heard before about the Kennedy assassination and how it happened. So welcome to the show, Peter.
Thank you for having me, Paul.
Great to have you on. So let me start by, there's 1,000 books have been written about the Kennedy assassination, right? And we had the 50th anniversary, right? And it just came. Now, 1,000 books, what makes Mary's Mosaic stand out from those 1,000 books? I've read most of this book, and I have my reasons for that, but I want to hear from you. What is the reason? What makes this book stand out?
Well, I think there are a number of things that make it stand out. First of all, the book is not only about President Kennedy's assassination indirectly, but it's also the story of a truly remarkable human being who happens to be a woman, Mary Pinchot Meyer. And I maintain that she played a very significant role in President Kennedy's life during the last 3 years of his life. And she was instrumental in helping him turn away from the Cold War toward world peace. And I think her composure during this entire relationship speaks to a level of integrity in this woman that's just rarely seen. And from my point of view, having known her as a young boy, growing up with her family, her middle child, Michael, was my best friend. She was like no other adult in my life. So her murder came as a huge shock to me, as your readers will discover in my book. And that's another dimension of this book, is that I write the book from the point of view of having been there for a lot of the time. And so I try and bring Mary to life from the point of view of first being seen through my eyes after having had this traumatic event in my life, which was the death of my best friend Michael, her middle child. And ultimately...
In a car accident, right?
In a car accident, yeah. And it's ultimately Mary who I think is able to reach me in a way that no other adult can, and just in terms of...
How old were you at that time?
I would have been 9 years old.
So this is your best friend who was killed in a tragic accident, his mother who reached out to you through her own grief to help you deal with your grief.
Yes, and that is what made an indelible impression in my psyche at a very early age. And that, took place in 1957, and in 1964, just 7 years later, I come home from boarding school at Thanksgiving 1964 and learn for the first time that she's been murdered a month earlier. I had no idea that this had even taken place.
So it's a double tragedy.
Oh, it's huge.
When did you become convinced you were going to write this book?
Well, I, like many people, only found out about Mary's life with President Kennedy in 1976 when the National Enquirer ran a story about it, broke the story about it. And it was at that time where I really started to wake up and realize that things were not as they seem. The other dimension that's brought out in the book is that my own father was a career CIA, high career CIA official, close friends with Cord Meyer, Jim Angleton, Desmond Fitzgerald.
And we're going to go through some of these names in a minute as we go through this. And here's some interesting photographs. Here's a photograph on the right. It's basically the color version of the photograph we see behind us. And you see President Kennedy with Mary Pinchot Meyer smiling. And then you see Mary Pinchot Meyer. We're focusing in there. Oh, beautiful. We got it on. Oh, beautiful focus. And there's Mary Pinchot Meyer at President Kennedy's 40th birthday. And there she is with her mother and President Kennedy at the Pinchot residence, right?
Correct.
And there she is there, beautiful woman. And so she was 44 years old. Young, I would say.
About to be 44.
Boy, she looks like she's 34.
Right.
I know, beautiful woman.
She's arguably one of the most beautiful women of an entire generation.
Right. Now, JFK was a bit of a ladies' man. How did, let's go through some of the history, how they met. How did JFK meet Mary Pinchot Meyer?
Well, that's a subject that I try and bring to life in the book, because President Kennedy graduates from the Choate School, a very prestigious boarding school in Wallingford, Connecticut, in 1935. And he first went to Princeton. However, during his freshman year at Princeton, he suffered a lot of infirmity. You know, he was a sick kind of guy to begin with, off and on.
Sure.
So that year, during his freshman year, he was in and out of the hospital. And he decided in the winter of 1936, having been in and out of the hospital, that he was going to go back to Choate, his alma mater, as a freshman in college, and attend the winter festivities weekend. So I don't
Homecoming,
know.
we would call it.
Homecoming, yeah. It's not clear what actually motivated him. I mean, here's this guy in college. Why would you want to go back to a prep school dance? You know, I mean, that's kind of like adolescent regression.
Right.
But he goes back to Choate, and lo and behold, Mary Pinchot is the date of William Atwood. Now, Bill Atwood, you know, would eventually be part of JFK's administration. And he was 2 years behind JFK at Choate. So she is Bill Atwood's date, only Bill has a little problem with laryngitis, and he's running up and down the stairs to gargle with Listerine, while JFK is cutting in on Mary and trying to make himself known. So this is where they met the first time, February 1936.
But why was she married to Cord Meyer, not to John F. Kennedy?
Well, that's a really good question. I think the answer to that is that at that time in JFK's life, you know, he's kind of the wealthy playboy type. She's not interested. She's even as a young girl, Mary aspires to a more meaningful relationship with a man. Cord Meyer comes back from World War II injured, realizing that he's made a huge mistake, that he has sacrificed his pacifist principles, which he held dearly while at Yale. And he's convinced when he comes back, he's wounded, he's lost an eye, he meets up with Mary. They'd known each other a little bit beforehand, but this is when they started to get serious. And I think what brought them together was they both had such profound pacifist orientations to wanting peace in the world. And Cord sets out at that time to somehow bring some new bureaucracy into existence that will help monitor international conflict so that war never happens again. This becomes the United World Federalist Movement, which Cord is the reigning rock star for a couple of years.
So she wants to be part of, so from an early time she wanted to be part of some peace movement.
They are the post-World War II glamour couple. I mean, they're the peace couple, you know, of what we would have seen.
The wounded veteran, the beautiful ingenue, they're coming together.
And she's helping him write his speeches. You know, she's doing a lot of editing for the writing he's doing.
Sure.
I mean, she's raising his children. I mean, she is doing a lot. You know, Mary was a journalist in her own right when she graduated from Vassar in 1942. That was one of her first jobs.
So what happened with her and Cord? How come
Cord
Meyer, by the way, for folks who look him up, very famous person. We're going to talk a little bit about him, but a lot more to be said. So why did they split up?
Well, what happens is that in the late 40s, it's clear that the United World Federalist Movement isn't going to go very far. And Cord gets very despondent. In my opinion, as a clinical psychologist, he's already alcoholic, as were, you know, many of those people in that era. And he becomes quite despondent, in and out of, I think, real depressions. And his father gets him an interview with Allen Dulles, who is starting up the CIA.
Sure.
Cord gets seduced by Allen Dulles, even though he wants to find a teaching position at some higher institution of learning, but they're not available. Mm-hmm. So he decides to go off and work for the CIA. And of course, Cord was the kind of man where he could have been great at anything. Mm-hmm. I mean, he's already won the O. Henry Award for the best short story.
Wow.
He's already published this book, Peace or Anarchy. Which
what was his specialty as a CIA agent?
Well, that's a good question. One of the things that he ran is something called Project Mockingbird, which was the real operation of the CIA's infiltration into the media. Mm-hmm. And Cord was a real star at getting this program up and running and functioning in a way that no one else could.
To put stories into the media that would support foreign policy as Allen Dulles saw it.
Exactly. If
And
the
he was
CIA,
famous for that,
if
yeah.
the CIA wanted a story slanted in a particular direction, it got it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they were actively manipulating the media in the
Could they be doing that now?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely.
Okay, that's another new. But Cord Meyer started it. He invented it as a.
Well, he was second. A man by name Frank Wisner was the first person, but Cord took it over from Frank and took it to just new levels.
Did you know that your dad was in the CIA when you were a kid?
I did, but I didn't understand what that really was. Right. I mean, there was a period of where, your dad's James Bond. He's the American James Bond, right? Yeah, I guess so. But it's not until I got to college as an undergraduate where I really stepped back and said, wait a minute here, what is really going on here?
Okay.
And this was, of course, at the height of the Vietnam War, the Vietnam conflict, and it was the beginning of major, major soul searching for me.
Okay, let's now jump ahead. So Jack Kennedy's United States Senator. He's married to Jacqueline Bouvier, now Jackie Kennedy, and she's pregnant with his kids, and he's running for president of the United States. What happens next in the story between him and Mary?
Well, I think in late 1960 is when certain sparks started to fly. I mean, potential. I don't think anything really fully got underway until early 1961.
Underway being
a full-fledged affair. Mm-hmm. Okay, and some people maintain that the affair didn't begin until 62. I try and show in the book that just wasn't the case.
And by the way, this is the book. Let me show Mary's Mosaic by Peter Janney, which is available where all books are available. It's all over the place. Forward by Dick Russell, and that's a picture of Mary Pinchot Meyer found dead, shot to death, less than 1 year after Kennedy's death, on the towpath in Washington, D.C., along the C&O Canal, still to this day an unsolved murder, and the most notorious murder in Washington, D.C. history.
That's right.
At least of that era. So we're going to be talking about that in a minute, but in that other photograph where you see her at Kennedy's 40th, or at his birthday party, 46th birthday party, and when I look at this picture of her at the 46th birthday party, which is right here, and wonder, isn't that the same party where they sang "Happy Birthday, Mr. President," where Marilyn Monroe?
No, that was a different one.
That was a different party. But his parties were legion, right?
Well, they tended to be. This was his last birthday party.
I see.
So this was in May of '63.
Okay, wow.
Yeah.
So I know he's May 17th, right?
29th.
May 29th. Oh, I'm May 25th. So that's sort of interesting. I always thought it was interesting. I had a close birthday. So they have this affair in the White House. She's coming. How do you know that they had an affair?
Well, there are a number of entries in the Secret Service logs of her coming in and out of the White House. So that establishes, an entrance and departure. Mm-hmm. There are also a number of people who saw them there, and those people over the years gave interviews to other authors, particularly an author who came before me, Leo D'Amour, and then Nina Burley. It's completely established that this was a bona fide affair of some substance. I want to say that, of course, we know now that JFK had a lot of problems with intimacy, a lot of problems with women in general. I maintain in the book, and I try and show the reader why and how, that this was really a relationship of redemption for JFK, because Mary was not threatened by him, and she wasn't going to put up with any nonsense with him. If he wanted to be with her, she demanded certain things from him, that he show up and start functioning. And of course, you have little tidbits.
And this is from a clinical psychologist. You know this kind of thing. You run into it a lot in your business.
Of course. But Ben Bradley famously says to Ben Bradley at a White House...
Ben Bradley says to who? I'm sorry?
President Kennedy says to Ben Bradley at one White House party, I think this was in February of '62, and Mary's over on the other side of the room, and Ben and Jack are talking, and he looks over and says, "Boy, Mary'd be rough to live with." Wouldn't she, Ben? And Ben said, "Well, take the right guy."
Now, what was the connection between Benjamin C. Bradley, who was the editor-in-chief of the Washington Post during Watergate, famously portrayed by Jason Robards in All the President's Men,
correct?
Right, one of the most famous newspaper editors living in America today. What was his connection to Mary Pinchot Meyer?
He was married to her sister, Tony Bradley.
So there was a family relationship.
Yes.
And there was also a relationship between the Kennedys and Ben Bradley as well. Between Jack, and they were friends for many years.
Yes, they were cordial friends. I think, at that age, it's tough. You have to have friends as a couple, and I think Jack and Jackie felt that Ben and Tony were some of their closest couple friends, and so they spent a certain amount of time together.
Right, and why this photograph, which on the book, which shows her dead, happened on the towpath, C&O Greenwich, the C&O Canal in Washington. The community there in Washington. Georgetown, thank you very much. In Georgetown, not exactly known for violent crime, not exactly a high crime area. This was near her home, where she lived.
Every day, Mary would go to her studio, which was actually in Ben Bradley's garage. It was a separate garage to the Bradley house on N Street in Georgetown. And then her routine she'd be paint in the morning, and then she would take a long walk after painting, which would go down into Georgetown and walk along the towpath out to Fletcher's Boathouse, which is about almost 2 miles, turn around and come back. So this was her routine. Now, I maintain in the book, with quite a bit of evidence, that she was being watched, and when this murder was planned and orchestrated, and I maintain that the CIA was behind it, she'd been under surveillance for a certain amount of time, and this was, they set it up to look like a random act of violence.
Who is they?
The intelligence world, the Central Intelligence.
And that's a central allegation you make in this book.
Yes,
the intelligence, the American intelligence establishment, of which you have some intimate knowledge, was responsible for this.
And the reason is that she had decided when the Warren, remember, she's murdered approximately just 3 weeks after the Warren Commission report is released.
And less than a year after Kennedy was. This is happened in October?
October of '64, October 12th. And so she's
49 years. It's going to be 50 years next year. Right?
That's right. And it was just 50 for Kennedy.
Yeah.
And so she's been under surveillance because they know how outraged she is by the Warren report. It's at this point that Mary realized that not only was there a conspiracy in Dallas to take out the president, but there's even a bigger conspiracy now to cover it up. And the Warren report is clearly part of that operation. And Mary has come to the realization that it is important for her to stand up and be counted.
Right.
Now, this is a very socially accepted woman in Washington. She's very well known. She's very well thought of.
Yeah.
If she were to stand up and essentially repudiate the Warren Report and tell the public who she was and what she had discovered, it would have caused a huge ripple effect in Washington, D.C.
Okay. There's two things I want to cover in the 8 minutes we have left, which isn't much. So one of the things I wanted to cover was the trial, and the other thing I wanted to cover was the Leary connection. So let's start with the Timothy Leary connection. What happened when Mary Pinchot Meyer would come to the White House and hang out with her lover, Jack Kennedy, while he was president of the United States?
Well,
besides what we know happened,
right.
What of interest to us happened?
well, let's begin by understanding that Mary is a seeker. Okay, she's an artist, but one of the interesting developments that's taking place in the late 1950s is that the artistic avant-garde community in Hollywood are exploring LSD. And there are a number of qualified psychiatrists out there who are doing controlled sessions. People like Cary Grant, Andre Previn, a number of Hollywood celebrities are dabbling in this because they feel it has opening them up. Mary wants to try it. So she explores the world of hallucinogens in the late 50s, early 60s.
With Tim Leary.
Well, she comes to Tim Leary in early 1962 because Mary has decided that what can best possibly help the world is that world leaders need a change or shift of consciousness. They need to experience cosmic consciousness, unity consciousness.
And you're a clinical psychologist, like these folks.
Yes.
So you know what you're talking about.
Yes,
This is interesting.
and I've been, in controlled clinical settings with the use of these substances myself. So I have an idea, of course. Mary thinks that were world leaders to partake of this experience, it would not immediately, but very quickly, they would see the futility of armed conflict, of war, and that she thinks it would push the evolution of humanity forward. So in 1962, she goes to Tim Leary, and she knocks on his door, and of course, Leary is very partial to beautiful women.
I met him.
He invites her to sit down and talk, and she says, "Look, I have this boyfriend in Washington. I can't tell you who he is or what he does, but I think that people in Washington, people of power, really need to have this experience. And by the way, I'm working with a group of women who are attached to some very powerful people, and we want to turn these men on to things like psilocybin and LSD to help the cause of peace."
So did President Kennedy and Mary Pinchot Meyer take LSD together in the White House?
Well, there's no absolute proof of that. However, there's a body of circumstantial evidence that I go through in the book that points to the very likelihood that shortly before Kennedy's American University commencement address in June of '63, it took place in May at a house in Georgetown. It was a very mild trip, nonetheless a little journey that they did take together. And I maintain that even a mild hallucinogenic experience can have a very powerful and lasting effect. Now, that isn't to say that, that's what, turned JFK into a peacenik. He was already on that trajectory. Coming out of the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, he realized, as did Khrushchev, that this was, in fact, the most dangerous moment in human history, and it could never happen again.
There's a lot of major events in that period. We don't have time to go into them, but he gave the American University speech in that summer, which folks can see. It's on YouTube, JFK's American University speech, where he lays out his plan for trying to bring about a more peaceful situation in the world and to ramp down the Cold War, which was really out of control by that time, or near out of control. He visited Hanford, where he pushed the N reactor, which we discussed earlier as interest of mine, which was an attempt to have a more peaceful use of nuclear power. And he met with met with Mary Pinchot Meyer at her home.
Oh.
2 days before he went to Hanford, right?
Yes.
And
in
that
Milford,
photograph that's
Pennsylvania.
behind us, right?
Yes.
I think that's the photograph behind
That's
us.
right. That's right.
So there was a lot going on here. Okay, so and a lot of people were against his idea of trying to have some rapprochement détente with the Russians.
Well, it was a group of particular people, and that would be, the military and the intelligence community. They realized that they could no longer control this guy, and they wanted a president that they could control. And he was basically thumbing his nose at them, and he said, no, I am not going to fuel this insanity that we know is the Cold War any longer.
Is that the motive in your mind for the assassination?
Yes. Overall, that's the motive, that they could not control him, that he was going to end the Vietnam War, that he was going to begin a rapprochement with Cuba, that he wanted to go to the moon with the Russians together as a united team.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there were just a number of peace initiatives.
Nowadays, they don't seem that we do all those things now. All those things have happened since then. Back then, though, it would have seemed pretty impossible.
Well, we would not have had the Vietnam War had Kennedy lived. He was coming out of Vietnam for sure, and that's actually historically established.
Right. Interesting. We have a minute and a half, and we're not going to have enough time to talk about the trial because somebody was actually arrested and charged with her murder, and that's this gentleman here. As they say, they picked up the first black guy they saw and charged him with the murder. And what was his name?
Raymond Crump. And what your viewers need to understand is that this trial was very, very significant. And in fact, Katie McCabe's book, Justice Older Than the Law, has now been optioned, and they're going to make a movie about this woman, Debbie Roundtree, who's just
the attorney, right?
The attorney who's just a legendary.
This is her right here.
A legendary human being in her own right.
There she is, right here.
And I maintain that there would be no Mary Meyer story without her.
She was the attorney who, and this was considered at the time similar to like the OJ case that they got this guy off. He really did it, but the fact of the matter was they couldn't prove it.
No, there was no evidence linking Ray Crump to the body of Mary Meyer or the crime scene.
Okay, so Peter Janney, you have 30 seconds. Peter Janney, author of Mary's Mosaic. We could barely touch on just a small part of this book. It's about the woman in the background standing with JFK and her relationship with JFK and how she might have tried to get him to bring peace. What do you think in 15 seconds? What should people take away from this book?
Well, I think people will have a wonderful experience reading the book. It's a book that reads like a novel, but it's factually correct.
Thank you very much, Peter Janney. Appreciate that.
Great to be with you.
That's it. Yeah, we did it.
Boy, I did.